Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about value. So you've started to experiment with value using hatching, cross-hatching, and stippling in your value scale, as well as your onion, garlic, and potato piece. But we're going to go a little bit deeper into what value does and where to really look for it, all the categories that it's made up of. And really, when we're talking about value, we're also talking about light. So I'm going to share my screen and go into a PowerPoint presentation, and then I'm going to also share with you two videos during the lecture. So when we're talking about value, we're really talking about the importance between light and dark. And when we talk about value, there's a lot of different ways that we can describe it, and we can use interchangeable terms to describe it. So when we're talking about value, we're really thinking about contrast. Again, that difference between what's light and what's dark. And that can also be called a tone. It could be called modeling, which is how light is changing over the surface of an object. We could call it light and shade, or we could call it chiaroscuro. And we'll talk a little bit more about chiaroscuro and what that Italian word means. As we're working with graphite, with charcoal, most drawing techniques, we're really talking about them as being achromatic. Achromatic means that they're devoid of color. When we get into color theory, which we don't cover in drawing 1, but if you take drawing 2 or painting, you will, graphic design, like we will cover color in those classes. And black and white are not a color. Black and white are a way that we can create value. Or we can change a color using black, white, and gray. But for the most part, when we're creating drawings, we're talking about drawings that are achromatic. Sometimes we incorrectly call them monochromatic. Monochromatic would mean one color, but the more accurate way of describing that is that they are achromatic. They are devoid of color because we're only dealing with black and white. When you look at a value scale, and this kind of value scale should look really familiar now that you created your own using your graphite pencils, we're talking about trying to move from something that's 100% white to 100% black, and all the variations of value in between. What I want you to notice within this value scale is how value interacts depending on what other values next to it. So in this bottom value scale, you'll see this little gray rectangle. And this little gray rectangle, the same value of which is placed inside of the middle of this entire value scale. And what you'll notice is that that same rectangle, while placed next to a really white value, looks darker, while placed within a dark field, looks lighter. So this is an optical illusion that happens as we place values next to each other. So something to note from that is if you want something to look lighter, put something dark next to it. And if you want something to look darker, put something light next to it. It's a little counterintuitive that having that contrast in between is going to bring out or make one value seem lighter and another one seem darker. There are two basic ways that we define form, and those are light and value. And you guys had just been working with line to create value. So things like hatching and cross-hatching, a contour line, weighted line are all ways that we can start to imply value and create value, like this hatching and cross-hatching that's happening in the shirt and in the background. But the other way is value itself, or we would call that tone or modeling. And we can really see that in the face, where the artist is no longer working with line to create value, but instead with the side of the charcoal and then erasing and adding back on to create highlights, to create deeper shadows, to create a variety of values within certain sections. So there's really two ways that we do that. And we can use the two ways together, or we can use them separately. Which leads us to a word that's really important in the arts, which is called chiaroscuro. And chiaroscuro describes the relationship between light and dark, and is really about a creation of a bold relationship between light and dark, where the subjects usually feel like they're emerging out of a really deep darkness. And I'll show you guys some examples of Caravaggio's work, who is an Italian artist that really is famous for this technique. So this is a historical term, as well as a way that we describe volume, modeling, and creating a three-dimensional form, creating three-dimensional looking objects. And that word chiaroscuro comes from an Italian word. It's really a combination of two Italian words that are chiaro, or clear and light, and oscuro, which means obscure or dark. I'll also play a video for you guys that, actually I'll play it now, that the person pronounces it with a really nice Italian accent. Not something that I'm necessarily able to do. So I'm gonna share my screen again. I'm gonna get to the video that I wanna show you. And I'm gonna make it big and unmute it, make sure that the closed captioning is on, and let's listen to this. This video comes from photography, but is very useful for us in drawing as well.
In the 15th century, Renaissance artists like Da Vinci and Caravaggio discovered that by applying a succession of lights and shadows to different planes in their images, they were able to add the illusion of dimensional depth. This innovative lighting technique is known as chiaroscuro. In Italian, that means light and dark. 600 years went by since the chiaroscuro technique was created and is still widely used to produce quality images in photography, cinematography, and television. Let's see how chiaroscuro works. This is a normal flat scene lit with a single light source placed at the camera's position. With flat lighting, the object appears like a circle. It has no roundness or depth. The moment that we bring the light around, we start creating modeling, and the plane circle suddenly starts showing its spherical dimension. Of course, everything else is dark, and we are still showing only a single plane in the image. Let's place one single light on the background. But instead of illuminating the entire background, we'll concentrate the light only behind the dark area. Now suddenly we have dimensional depth, as the object and the background are separated by light and dark areas. This is the very basic principle of chiaroscuro. Also notice how smaller details that were not visible when the light was directly in front of the object are now becoming more prominent. Let's take it one step further. Let's place more objects in the image. The chiaroscuro technique is clearly showing dimensional depth, as light placement not only is giving us the spherical dimension on each object, but light and dark areas distinctively separate each plane in the image. Now let's use some lighting and other techniques to concentrate the viewer's attention in one portion of the image only. We can accomplish this by lowering the light intensity on everything that is not of primary importance in order to make the main point of interest stand out from the rest. We can also accomplish the same result by using selective focusing, so only what's important will be in sharp focus. If we want something to really stand out, in addition of creating separation with selective light intensity and selective focusing, we can do it by adding color lighting to a specific part of the image. Just look at the comparison of what the chiaroscuro technique can do to our images.
And I'm gonna exit out of there and go back to my PowerPoint. So chiaroscuro can be incredibly useful in thinking of ways to not only create a relationship between light and dark, but also create focus in your work. So I'm going to show you guys two Caravaggio pieces that use this chiaroscuro technique that really allows the viewer to feel like these subjects are emerging out of darkness. In this piece by Caravaggio, Joseph Joseph the Carpenter, a lot of the imagery from the Renaissance had religious themes, and these two images do as well. And so here we see a man working, Joseph, and he's a carpenter. So we can start to assume that this is actually the father of Jesus Christ, who was a carpenter, and that this little boy helping him holding the light is Christ himself. Unusual to show Christ as a young boy rather than an infant. And Caravaggio does this very specifically. In a lot of his artwork, he is showing people that we often think of as saintly or religious figures in a way that makes them everyday people. So he was considered a humanist and really creating this attention to humanity and bringing humanity to every subject that he was painting. But let's take a look at the painting itself and how the artist uses value and composition, which we've started to talk about. So let's take a look at the composition first. Think about where your eye goes when you first look at this image. It probably goes to the brightest part, which happens to be Christ's face. And Caravaggio has done something really interesting. The illumination from the candle is being blocked by the hand of the little boy. And so that light makes it seem like it's coming directly from Christ's face itself, which is a nod to talk about his religious status or his saintly status. And then after we go here at this really brightest spot, we kind of follow the rest of the light. So we follow the diagonal of Joseph's head and body down to his arm and foot, and then back up Christ's foot back to the face. So we're kind of going into this triangular shape, and Caravaggio is very much using diagonals and an asymmetric composition, which we talked about last time, using rule of thirds. We can, if you notice, your view and the majority of area that is light stays on the right-hand side, while the rest of the composition on the left stays pretty dark. You can see that chiaroscuro lighting, really bright areas that are coming from a single light source. And then in the background, we do have a secondary light that's illuminating things so that we can see what's happening between the legs. Sometimes we can't even see that, or at least not in this documentation, this photograph of this painting. I think that in the painting itself, you probably could. But really beautiful, amazing painting. That translucency in the fingers I called out in this slide just because it's so wonderfully done. And let's look at one more image by Caravaggio. This image it still shows Christ and his disciples, and it's Christ right after he is resurrected. And so they are surprised. He appears to them. And you can see kind of the shock on everybody's face that this gentleman is kind of gripping the table in disbelief, almost, like he's about to stand up. This person has his hands fully played out, and then this person seems skeptical, he's actually unsure, how is Christ here? And if we look at the composition again, the lightest part in the composition is actually coming from Christ's face one more time, and kind of the surface of the table, but it gives this illusion that Christ himself is kind of lighting this entire scene. And our eye goes from his face down the diagonal that's being created by their bodies, down the edge of horizontally over the edge of the table, and then back up to these three figures, and continues back within this idea of a triangle, using a diagonal and still using an asymmetric composition, where the rule of thirds or golden mean are still applied, where that table is taking up 1/3 of the composition itself, and then the majority of figures are on the right-hand third. And if we look at the way that the scene is lit and the lighting itself, again, we see a lot of that chiaroscuro lighting on the face, very little in the background. The background really becomes like almost black. We can't tell what's happening there, but the figures feel like they can continue to continue in that space, even though we can't see their edges. So Caravaggio is a very important artist, and again, someone that you should relate to this chiaroscuro technique. And hopefully the video and these kind of start to give you an idea of that kind of emerging out of darkness. When we get into our drawings this week, we're going to be working with charcoal, and we're going to be using a subtractive technique. So we're going to start with midtones and then pull the lighter values back out of our composition. And so this technique really works well for chiaroscuro. So let's talk about light itself and how it affects value. So in order for us to understand value, we need to understand that light is the reason why we can see value. When light hits an object, it reveals the planes of that object. It shows us where there are changes in direction of the plane, like the planes on the face. When we were looking at our self-portraits, we were able to see that, and we started to draw in those planes using planar analysis. And so the light really reveals the shape of the object. And if you have one light source, and if you have just one light source, you're going to have 6 areas of light. And all those areas of light are also describing shadow. So the 6 areas of light are highlight light, shadow, core shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow. In this week's assignment, we are going to be using an egg to understand that form. And in the assignment, I do have a video that talks about the egg and how to see value, and I'm going to play that for you guys right now.
Today, we're going to be talking about value. And to talk about value, we need to talk about light. The reason why we see value is because light is hitting the surface of an object, curving around that surface, and illuminating its form. Where the light can't reach, where that form is bending away from the light source, we start to see its modeling of the form itself, which starts to go into shadow. In this example, I have an egg, and I have a single light source pointed at that egg so that we can see the simplest kind of value transitions. When we're looking at value and thinking about the basics, we're really thinking about 6 different areas of value. They are light, shadow, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, and highlight. As we look at this egg, we can see that the front part of the egg itself is cast in light. So the light is hitting that object directly. That part of the object is facing the light, therefore the whole part of that egg is lit and is in light. This part of the egg, the back part of the egg, the part that's facing away from the light, is in shadow. And we can see that that form is bending as eggs do. They're curving away from that light source. And so there's a gradual transition and a gradation in the value that's going back into that shadow. Then, if we look inside of the shadow, we see that there's an area that gets really dark. And it's this area here that is almost like a crescent that follows the contour of the egg itself. And we call that the core shadow or core of shadow. We can also call that the terminator. And that core shadow is the part of the shadow that gets the deepest and darkest, and is the area where light can no longer bend around that form, and therefore is the darkest part. Now, you might be thinking, if that is the shadow, why is this area on the bottom so light? And that's a great question. That is actually reflected light. So that is light that is coming from the light source, and that light source isn't only hitting the egg, it's hitting everything around the egg. So the white paper that the egg is sitting on is reflecting the light and bouncing back onto that object. And we can see that by taking a darker sheet of paper and placing it and blocking that reflected light, we can see that that part of the egg is actually in shadow and that it is light that is bouncing off the surface of other objects like this paper and casting back onto the egg that is creating that lighter area, that reflected light. We also have the cast shadow. So we see the cast shadow here, and that cast shadow is being created by having the light source fully blocked by the object itself. Therefore, cast shadows are in the shape of the objects that they are connected to. In this case, a sphere or an egg. So that shadow is going to be curved. Now, the last part that we haven't talked about yet is the highlight. So when you have an object that is reflective, that has a shiny surface, you'll have a highlight, like this area here. And that highlight is a part of value that's not stationary, while all the other parts of value, light, shadow, foreshadow, reflected light, and cast shadow are. That light is coming in from the light source, coming in, hitting that object, and then bouncing directly into the camera. Therefore, if I move my head, that highlight sits on a different part of the egg depending on my position viewing that object, while none of the other shadows move. So let's do a little experiment so we can see that. I'm going to take my egg. I'm going to mark where I see that highlight in the camera. Let's see if I can make sure it doesn't move. And then I'm going to move the camera itself and go a little higher with it. And what we'll see is that that highlight is now moved over, while none of the other values have moved. So let's put the camera back. And we can see that that highlight is now reflecting back in the same spot. So the areas of light and value that we should understand and think about are light, shadow, reflected light, core shadow, cast shadow, and highlight. And again, we only see highlights on objects that are themselves shiny rather than objects that are matte. Thank you so much.
And I'm gonna go back to my PowerPoint again. So like I said in the video, and you can see very clearly in this example, probably more clearly than even in the video, the light area of the sphere we'll call light. The part of the sphere that isn't, that light can't bend around is shadow. There's a core shadow that gets deeper, reflected light that is coming off of objects bouncing around the space that the object is sitting on, bouncing back on that object, cast shadow, and highlight. And again, if we have an object that is more matte, like some of your eggs, when you're drawing eggs, might not have a highlight depending on their texture. So these areas of light, you can see them if you have a single light source, but sometimes if you have multiple light sources, which is a regular lighting situation, like you might have a light from inside your house or coming from a window, or if we're in a classroom, we might have multiple light sources overhead. What will happen is that some of these areas will repeat or overlap. So we might have less shadows, we might have multiple cast shadows, we might have diminished core shadows, multiple highlights, etc. Other things to just think about, when you have a light source, it functions like a cone. So the light closest to the light source is pretty kind of close together, and the further away it gets, the longer of a shadow it's going to cast. So if we have light from the sun, for example, it's going to, depending on the angle that is at during the day, is going to create a different kind of shadow than a lamp on an object, for example. So think about light as being in a cone, and also that the light is going to correspond with the edges of the object itself, and that those shadows are going to stay within that cone of the light. Also, as you have light that's further away, more of the object will be cast in light. And the closer the light gets, more of the object will be cast in shadow. So less of the object will be cast in light. And it's because the light can't kind of go around that curve of the object itself. So the further away the lighter the object is going to be on both sides. The closer it is, the more this access of shadow is going to be more dominant if the light gets closer. Shadows or highlight, light, core shadow, shadow, cast shadow, and reflected light can be seen in all kinds of objects, not just a sphere. So just some examples of where we see that. So we see highlight on the top of this cube, really light on the side of the cube, core shadow on the side of the cube that's not facing the light, core shadow right when it gets closest to the area of light. And then reflected light, we usually see it somewhere in the background, somewhere within the shadow itself. And you can see that that's the same with cubes, cones, cylinders, pyramids, any other shape. And we can think about that most things that we see in nature, we can actually simplify to these kind of geometric forms. Also, just to say again that cast shadows are in the shape of the shadow of the object that they are bathing in light. And that, again, the light source kind of functions as a vanishing point in a way. So as the light hits the object, if you project that light further through the object, you can understand why its shadow is in that shape. So if you have a object like a cylinder, that cast shadow is going to be look like a cylinder. If you have a cone, that shadow is going to look like a triangle, etc. The other thing to think about is that objects have their own value. So we call that local value. So the value of a white onion compared to an avocado are going to be very different from each other. They still have all the areas of light. You can see light, shadow, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, highlight on this onion. On the potato, we have everything but highlight because the potato is matte. We can't see it, but we see that it has light, it has a core shadow, it has reflective light, cast shadow. Same thing with the avocado. It's bathed in light, it has a shadow, there's a core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, highlight. But the range of value within each of these objects is different because the value that they themselves are, their local value. And so all the values in the onion are going to stay in the high key. All the values in the avocado are going to stay in the low key. And then the values for the potato are going to stay in that middle key. And it's okay that an object does not have the extremes, that maybe this onion doesn't have the darkest dark. It's still going to have a range of value, even if it doesn't incorporate the most like dark of that value. And we can use high key and low key within an entire composition. So for example, these two photographs are using that. So in this photograph, you have a white shirt that's all in the high key. It doesn't include almost any darker values. And in this wonderful photograph that has that chiaroscuro effect on the left, we see that all the values stay towards the low key of the value scale. This week, we're going to be working with charcoal. It's going to be messy. I'm sure that you guys remember it from Negative Space. And we're going to be working subtractively. So we're actually going to start our drawings very similarly to how we started our negative space drawings where you're going to take charcoal and you're going to cover the entire sheet of paper first. You're going to be using compressed charcoal, your charcoal pencil set, your magic eraser, a Mars eraser, and kneaded eraser, as well as newsprint. And during one of the assignments, you're going to be drawing an egg and creating these 6 areas of value that we were just talking about, trying to create at least 6, but really starting to think through not only the values themselves from light to dark, but also can I create light, shadow, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow, highlight. And then can I create a gradation in the background that's going to create that chiaroscuro effect that we were just learning about. And in our second assignment, we're going to be working towards 10 values. And so you'll be mostly working with white objects and trying to create a full value range of 10 different values. So if you, sorry, switching screens one more time. So if you look at our online discussion 14, subtractive drawing egg, you'll see that there's a video that we just watched that is describing the areas of light, then a demo video from me showing you how to create this value with egg. We're going to start with mid-tone paper. You're going to create a value scale using charcoal, so you learn how you can recreate a full range of values with your charcoal. You're going to draw with planar analysis, and then start adding in the darker areas first, subtracting out the lighter areas, and then only at the very end using a white charcoal pencil. I recommend getting an egg and hard boiling the egg so that you don't accidentally break it while you're drawing it. Otherwise, if you break it, you can eat it. If you don't hard boil it, it might be a little bit harder to do that. And then worst case scenario, if you don't have a white egg, I would use a white egg rather than a brown egg. I do have 2 photographs that you can use. And then for your next assignment after this one, see if I can get to the bottom and go next. You're going to be working on creating 10 values. You're going to be creating a still life for yourself. Here I used white objects and a reflective object. Same thing, starting with with a gray toned paper, creating a value scale, then using organizational line citing, contour line and planar analysis to create the drawing itself, then blocking in shadows before starting to lift out highlights, and then adding those shadows back in, making sure that they make sense and kind of going deeper with it, dealing with the background, and then creating a final piece. So that's what you guys, I'm going to stop sharing. That's what you guys have happening this week. And I hope that you're starting to understand value a little bit more. And now that you really understand line as value, you're going to start thinking about tone and modeling and creating this chiaroscuro effect. Thank you.